Section 21 of The Age of the Condottieri by Oscar Browning. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9, Savonarola, Part 3. In external politics, the party of the Piagnoni always held more or less closely to the King of France, and hoped for his return to Italy. The opposite party were attached to the League of Venice, which had intercepted Charles VIII at Fornovo. Of these, Milan and the Pope were powerful members, and the Pope had recently shown his feeling against France by giving the consecrated hat to Henry VII of England. The party of Savonarola were very careful to keep the elections to the public offices favourable to themselves, the more so because they feared the vengeance of the friends of the executed conspirators. The Signory which governed Florence in the last month of 1497 were favourable to Savonarola, and they continued to negotiate with the Pope in his favour. But the friar did not await the result of these interventions, and on the evening of Christmas Day in that year he celebrated Mass. At last, on February 11th, 1498, he again ascended the pulpit in the cathedral. This is a very important event, as it was a direct denial of the Pope's authority. In his sermon he spoke of the excommunication and denied its validity. He said that it had been brought about by the Florentines, whose only desire was to do away with good living and the commonweal. He said that if he did not preach, he should be excommunicated by Christ. To whom, he said, should you betake yourselves? To those who are blessed by the Pope and whose life is a shame to Christianity, or to those who are excommunicated by the Pope but whose life brings forth fruit of truth and daily becomes better? A change now took place in the attitude of the Pope toward Florence. It was believed that Charles VIII was preparing another expedition into Italy, and the Florentines expected by this means to recover the possession of Pisa, which was the great object of their desire. But the Pope now suddenly promised to give them Pisa, and said that in his eyes its union with Florence would be favourable to the unity of Italy. The Florentines were on their side inclined to accept the offer. It would cost them nothing, whereas Charles would demand a contribution in money. On February 26th, Alexander wrote to complain that Savonarola, although excommunicated, was performing priestly functions, and asked that he should be arrested and sent to Rome. He, however, continued to preach, and prophesied the terrible retribution that would fall upon his country. O Italy, thou shalt be given into the hands of savage people, a barbarous race, who shall only take pleasure in doing you harm and slaughtering men, and in the sight of blood. They will be barbarians, cruel as lions, and will come from this side and from that. Italy then shall be given into the hands of a strange people, every one of which will rack his brains to do thee harm, and even the worst they can. And it shall be worse for Rome than for any other city. Your property, your treasures, shall be given into their hands. This many years later, in 1527, seemed to the Piagnoni a prophecy of the descent of Constable Bourbon and of the sack of Rome. The Pope's brief of February 26th was referred to a committee which was favourable to the friar. An ambassador was sent to Rome with explanations, but he found the Pope very angry, and he threatened Florence with an interdict. On March 9th, in another brief, he attacked the doctrines and the orthodoxy of the friar. The citizens were told that to hear the friar preach was a sin, that they might be absolved if they confessed immediately and promised not to offend again, but that if they continued in their contumacy, they would be papally excommunicated and could only be absolved by the Pope. A party now arose of young men of family who were opposed to the friar. The head of these was Dolfo Spini. Party spirit ran high. Some said that Fra Girolamo was a good and holy man, but that it was safer to obey the Pope. An interdict would destroy the commerce and prosperity of Florence. Others, amongst whom was Francesco Valori, asserted that the Frate was a direct messenger from God, and that the Pope had no authority to prevent his preaching. At last, on March 17th, a new committee determined to ask Savonarola to suspend his preaching. He said to the messengers who brought the news, "Is that your will, my lords?" They said, "It is." He replied, "I have another lord whom I must consult. I will give my answer tomorrow." The next day he preached his farewell sermon. He said that true believers must have recourse first to their confessor, then to the bishop, then to the Pope, but if all these forsake him, he must go to Christ and say, "Thou art my confessor, thou art my Pope." He agreed to obey the orders of the committee, but declared that some sign from heaven would soon be given to prove the truth of his mission. Savonarola did not give up the struggle. He persuaded his friends to write to the Florentine ambassadors in France and Spain that the time was come in which a general council ought to be called. He drafted letters on the same subject to the Emperor Maximilian, the kings of France, Spain, England, and Hungary. In these he declared Alexander not to be a true pope. These letters were never sent, but they were written. The schism in the city was not healed. Crowds still flocked to St. Mark's to hear the devoted friend of Savonarola, Fra Domenico of Pesca, who took his place in the pulpit. At last a strange method was adopted for deciding the quarrel. In the year 1063 a monk of Vallombrosa had charged the Bishop of Florence with having obtained his see by simony. The charge was rejected by the Lord of Florence at that time, but the monk offered to prove his case by passing unhurt through 2 rows of burning faggots. He did so with safety, and the bishop was condemned. Fra Domenico da Pesca now offered to pass through the fire to prove the truth of Savonarola's teaching, and a Franciscan friar of Santa Croce offered to enter the flames with him to prove the contrary. They would both be burned, but the truth would prevail. The authorities of the city doubted for a long time if they should permit the ordeal, but at last they did so. If Fra Domenico was burned, Savonarola was to leave the city. Everything was arranged. The gates were closed, the streets guarded. The trial was to take place on Saturday, April 7th, 1498, the eve of Palm Sunday, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The propositions which Fra Domenico was prepared to defend were these: the Church of God needs renovation. It shall be scourged. It shall be renewed. Florence also, after scourging, shall be renewed and shall prosper. Unbelievers shall be converted to Christ. This shall all come to pass in our own time. The excommunication recently launched against our reverend father, Brother Girolamo, is null and void. Those who do not observe it do not sin. The platform necessary for the ordeal was erected in the great square of the Signory. It was 40 ells long and 5 wide, covered with earth, and paved with stones so as to resist the fire. A pathway an ell wide was left in the middle, and on each side were piled up the faggots and logs of wood. The brothers of the 2 orders arrived at the spot and took up their position in the Loggia de Lanzi on the south side of the square. The Franciscans advanced in silence without ceremony, but Fra Domenico was dressed in full priestly robes and held in his hand a huge crucifix. Savonarola was also clad in a pluvial and carried a pyx with the consecrated host. Some citizens with lighted candles accompanied him. The Dominicans had been celebrating divine service in St. Mark's and marched to the square chanting psalms with a loud voice. An unexpected difficulty arose. The Franciscans demanded that Fra Domenico should take off his robes and dress like a Franciscan. They also would not allow him to enter the flames with the crucifix and the host. Savonarola would not permit him to go otherwise. The dispute carried till dusk, and the people were disconcerted and confused. The friends of Dolfo Spini, the Arrabbiata, and the Companacci, as they were called, proposed to seize Savonarola. The feeling of the people was now strongly against the Dominicans. They said that their wish to carry the host and the crucifix into the flames was an insult to God. The Franciscan had offered to enter the flames alone. The whole thing was a trick and a delusion. On Palm Sunday, Savonarola preached in St. Mark's, but those who went to hear him were threatened by the Companacci. A Dominican preaching in the afternoon in the cathedral was interrupted by loud cries. The tumult spread from the church to the streets. The people rushed to St. Mark's to bring the business to an end. The Signory in vain summoned them to lay down their arms, on the condition that Savonarola should leave the city in 12 hours. They continued to shout against him and against Valori. Valori, who was at St. Mark's, returned with difficulty to his house, and on his way from thence to the public palace was met by some of the relations of the men whom he had had executed, and was murdered. The monks defended their convent as well as they could against attack. Savonarola stood before the altar in the midst of his novices, with the host in his hand, the brethren kneeling around him in prayer. Then appeared the messengers from the Signory, bidding him to go with them. They guaranteed him against violence, and he determined to obey. He took leave of his brother friars in an affecting speech, urging them to remain firm in faith, prayer, and patience, and swearing to them before the sacrament that he had never preached anything but the truth. They then proceeded with lights and torches and a large body of soldiers to the public palace, where he was thrown into prison. Savonarola's strength had lain in his opposition to the Pope, an opposition intensified by the different characters of their morality. Florence now desired to be friends with the Pope, and the supernatural foundation on which the friar had attempted to base his mission had broken down. His political enemies rose against him, his religious supporters could no longer defend him. The days which followed were most painful. Savonarola was examined under torture. We cannot be sure of the authenticity of the confessions thus extorted. It is said that he gave himself up to despair, that he doubted of the reality of his mission, that he confessed that he had always expected some supernatural intervention which never came. It is asserted that he admitted that his object had been the glory of the world, and to have credit and reputation, and that with this object he had invented his prophecies. The Signory, which entered upon office on May 1st, 1498, was the bitter enemy of the friar. On May 22nd, he and 2 friars, his companions, were condemned to death. They were first to be hanged and then burned. Their offence was declared to be heresy in denying the Pope to be the true Pope, the perversion of Holy Scripture, and the divulgence of the secrets of confession, as well as the causing of dissension and deaths in the city. The last night of Savonarola in prison was spent in a parting colloquy with his disciples. They communicated together and then watched in prayer. After this, Savonarola slept peacefully, his hand resting on the knee of Jacopo Niccolini, who had come to comfort him. The other friars were executed on May 23rd in the square of the Signory, on the very place where the platform had been prepared for the ordeal. They were divested of their orders. They then received a plenary indulgence from the Pope, which they acknowledged with reverence. The first hanged was Maruffi, then Buonavicini, then Savonarola. As he mounted the ladder to his execution, he gazed with widely opened eyes upon the crowd which had thronged to see him die, and called out, "My people, what have I done to you, that you should treat me thus?" They were all dead before their bodies were burnt. Their ashes were thrown into the Arno, but their memory was long preserved, and for many years reverent and loving hands placed fresh flowers on the spot where they had suffered on the anniversary of their execution. End of section 21.